You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Climate change is complicated, it's complex, and given how important it is across so many sectors and disciplines, there's a real need to boost the skills and knowledge of the workforce. Sometimes we might think that it's only the climate science folk tasked with shaping our future. Today we're going to learn about why that might not be entirely true. Hi and welcome to Climate Conversations. I'm Jack Board. And hello to Liling Tan. Liling, what did you study to get to where you are today?
Hello, Jack. I studied quite a wide range of topics. I started with an associate's degree in liberal arts and humanities, so things like history, philosophy, some art history. And then I did...
Very refined.
Well, thank you. And then I did a double major in journalism and political communication, which is kind of like political science, but more focused on the communicative aspect of it. And you? What did you study?
Straight up Bachelor of Arts / Communications Journalism. So yeah, journalist from the beginning for me.
Yeah.
How are you? What are you up to at the moment in Singapore?
I'm doing good. I've been busy multitasking, working with reporters at CNA's Singapore desk on news coverage, keeping an eye on developments around the world, and having lots of climate conversations. What about you? I hear you are on an island, smack in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Please tell me you're doing something absolutely fabulous and glamorous.
You're right, I'm on an island. Not so glamorous, though, I'd say. I'm in one of the most remote nations on the planet. It's Kiribati. Way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's really tiny and also really huge at the same time. The whole country consists of coral atolls, a bit like the Maldives.
Wow.
All up there are 32 of them. The land size is actually really similar to Singapore, but get this, it's spread out over 3.4 million square kilometers. So it's the only country in the world that is in the Northern Hemisphere, it's in the Southern Hemisphere, the Eastern Hemisphere, and the Western Hemisphere. So I haven't seen much of it yet, but I did capture some of that bright blue, clear, shining water on the way from the airport, and that looked pretty special. Yeah, just flew here from Fiji earlier today, which was beautiful as well.
Wow.
So,
Island hopping.
yeah, a little bit. I'm looking at the kind of the impacts of rising sea levels and how the impacts will affect people on a community and cultural level. So yeah, some exciting stuff. Let's get into it. We'll start with our climate quiz question of the week. See if you can get it by the end of the podcast. Now, Liling, European judges have recently ruled that a certain country has actually breached the human rights of its citizens by not doing enough to cut national greenhouse gas emissions. A really intriguing and important finding. I want to know, which country was it? And the answer at the end. I'll leave you to stew on that one.
All right, stewing.
Okay, let's go to the newsroom now and look at some of the most interesting stories in the climate space this week. Liling, what has caught your eye?
Well, camels have caught my eye.
Camels.
The big question.
Okay.
Yeah. The big question is whether camels will be the next cows. We know they already are in some communities in the Middle East farming them. A recent commentary about this is gaining quite a lot of buzz, sheds light on how this ancient dairy farming practice is gaining steam today as an ideal livestock in the climate change context. And as we know, camels are native to harsh desert conditions, and the authors, two Oxford University professors, they pointed out how camels have actually evolved over all these centuries to cope with hot days and freezing cold nights in the desert. But get this, they're also better than cows. They consume less water, less vegetation, and they also produce less methane. So could camels be the next cows? It sounds like they should be. Jack, you ever tried camel milk?
I don't know if I have. I have been through the Middle East quite a bit. I've definitely had a lot of goat milk and cheese.
kind of gamey,
I've definitely
right?
ridden a camel, but camel is the next cow. I don't know if we'll be seeing that in our part of the world, but who knows? And another thing popping up in Singapore, some new electric harbour craft. What's that about?
Yes, quite a bit happened recently in this maritime space. In early April, Singapore started testing out its first ever charging point for electric harbour crafts, which are, of course, the boats that ply local waters. Now, this comes after local startup Pixis in late March also showed off its first fully electric boat, which is being used to transport crew and personnel from shore to ships anchored further out at sea. Now, all of this is part of this massive move by Singapore to reduce the industry's carbon footprint, and the goal is to have all new boats plying local waters to be fully electric from 2030 or use a range of biofuel or net zero fuel. So, charting the green course.
All right, let's get to our main story this week. Liling, take it away.
The extraordinary scale and scope of the climate battle requires an army of epic proportions, made up of biologists, geographers, and environmental scientists, not to mention politicians and policymakers, and that is just the start. Today, we look at what all hands on deck really means when it comes to this fight for our survival and how it must draw from different expertise and experiences. Here to flesh this out with me are Professor David Taylor from the Department of Geography at the National University of Singapore and Dr. Janice Lee from the Asian School of the Environment at Nanyang Technological University. This segment is in collaboration with the inaugural Ideas Festival. You can find out more at www.ideasfestival.edu.sg. Dr. Taylor, Dr. Lee, welcome to Climate Conversations. What do you do now, and what did you have to study to get here? Dr. Taylor, let's start with you.
At present, I'm working on a number of projects, either to do with pollution, but also to do with governance of the environment, how we make decisions about the environment, and how we ensure that those decisions are appropriate, equitable, and sustainable. I initially studied botany and geography as a first degree. It was a combined honours degree. And then I went on to do a PhD in the environmental sciences. And I studied across a range of what would be called disciplines, multi-disciplines.
Give me an idea of what you're working on now in the Singapore context.
So one thing I've worked on in the past is looking at pollution here in Singapore and the extent to which that pollution, air pollution in particular, is from non-local sources, so transboundary sources, so coming from neighbouring parts of the region, for example. And of course, the kind of solution to those problems of transboundary pollution, such as haze being one of them, but other forms of pollution as well, just doesn't lie here in Singapore, it lies elsewhere. And so there's an economic dimension, there's a political dimension, in addition to the kind of environmental science dimension, human health dimension. Another project is looking at carbon sinks, so nature-based carbon sinks, which would be things like peatlands, forests, soils, mangroves, seagrass beds, and looking at how they're managed, how they're governed, and maybe how they can be better managed and governed.
Well, that's quite vast, isn't it? From environment here all the way to carbon sinks, forests and all that. It's really quite an extensive area of work. Dr. Lee, what about you? Tell us what you do, what area of work you're in, and what did you have to do to get here?
Right now, I consider myself as a land system science person. So I look into the process and also the mechanism and the consequences of land use and land cover change. Specifically, I've been working quite a bit on deforestation as a result of palm oil expansion, but also looking into processes of fire and peatland management in neighboring parts of the region. So previously, I had actually majored in life sciences in NUS. I was really considering geography as well, but I was quite interested in going to conservation. And so like the life sciences program had a specific area into ecology. And I worked under Professor Navjot Sodhi looking into conservation biology, which I think broadened my perspective on what are some of the issues that concern the conservation of biodiversity. So not just biology itself, but also how do people make decisions about land use. And that spans many different disciplines, for example, geography, politics and international relations and economics. So when I did my PhD, I moved more into an interdisciplinary project, which is looking into palm oil, which is more on the smallholder sector. And following that, I would say that I have dabbled in many different types of projects that are also very interdisciplinary in nature. So for example, working with my Earth Observatory Singapore's colleagues to look into the effects of hazards and also food and agriculture, specifically on rice systems. And then dabbling also into the topics of tropical peatland management and restoration, where we receive a funding from the Singapore government to look into peatland restoration in the region.
So it sounds like a lot of your work overlap as well. And both of you talked about the different disciplines that come into play here. Now, in many of these dealings and projects that you work on, having to collaborate with people from different disciplines. That must be quite chaotic at the start. How do you go from sheer chaos to getting everybody on the same page so that there is some sort of a significant outcome? Prof. Taylor?
Well, I think you have to meet quite a lot. You have to be prepared to have meetings. But I think also you need to have respect for those other disciplines and the people who are working within those, to have an open mind, and also be prepared to perhaps speak a different language to the language that you're normally used to speaking to. Because one of the things about disciplines, it does create these silos, and people are quite comfortable working within those silos and develop their own language, which is great for communicating within that discipline, within that silo, but not so good for communicating across disciplinary boundaries. So I think also there is that need to start thinking about, well, other people, not necessarily in my discipline, are going to need this knowledge. I need to perhaps tone down the disciplinary language a bit and make it more accessible.
Dr. Lee, how do you overcome these disparate views in different fields of work?
Communication is super important. So I'm making sure that we are meeting up frequently, like what Prof. Taylor said. I think all these communication processes help us to focus and also to clarify what the concepts are, what the questions are. I think we are also in an age where we realize that each discipline cannot answer such a big issue like biodiversity crisis or climate change. So I think there definitely is also a lot more awareness among different academics about the importance of interdisciplinary research.
How does food and agriculture tie into your line of work in pollution and haze?
So in certain food production systems, the process of that food production requires burning of biomass. For example, in the case of Indonesia, fires are also being used in that process of preparing the land for food and agriculture production. So, I think it's more, if we look into the whole process of the food production, then there are steps in which it involves burning processes, and that's where issues related to pollution and also transboundary issues related to pollution can arise.
So what are the different disciplines that would be required to come to the table to address this?
Firstly is to monitor and also to study the processes of burning. And that requires, for example, satellite imagery, where you need to engage with geographers, people who study satellite images to monitor and to understand the processes of fire occurrences and air pollution. Mm-hmm. But satellite images can only tell us one side of the story, because I think you need to go onto the ground and then to talk to people and understand also who are the people who are involved. And you will find that actually it's not just the proximate causes, but also the underlying drivers of that whole process of land change or post-processing that also needs to be considered. And that's why it's very important to engage with political ecologists, people who work on sociology, to really understand the network of actors who actually might be involved or responsible behind these land use changes that we observe from satellite imagery.
Dr. Taylor, tell me a little bit about what you've done in this area and why it ties into your work.
So a few years ago, I was involved in a project that was funded by Irish Aid, and it was looking at the impact of environmental changes on food security in a part of Uganda called Karamoja in Eastern Africa. I actually brought NUS undergraduate students with me to do some of the fieldwork related to the research, and we're looking at the impact of variations in availability of food on local communities, and the resilience of people in these local communities was heavily impacted by high incidence of HIV/AIDS and also political insecurity in the area. And I think the students from NUS were quite surprised to see how economically poor people were in these communities. They could only afford to eat once a day. At most, they couldn't afford meat. So that was their perspective. But from the perspective of the local people who we were working with, they felt that we from outside were really poor because we didn't own cattle. We didn't have access to land to grow our own crops. So when we're talking about interdisciplinarity, I think it's also really important to consider these kind of non-traditional disciplines like indigenous knowledge, for example, especially when it comes to looking at things like climate change and its impacts and how we adapt and cope with climate change. We don't all see the environment in the same way. We don't all share the same values. And so for me, that's one of the challenges of interdisciplinarity, but it's also one of the drivers of my interest in it.
You talked about HIV/AIDS, which brings me to my next question about diseases that either arrive because of changes in the climate and environment or diseases that will become worse, like dengue. Beyond the biologists and the virologists and the epidemiologists who are working on diseases, why is it important to also bring to the table people with backgrounds in geography or environmental science when we look at the risks of diseases that might emerge or become worse?
It is also an interaction between the human population and the environmental factors. And I think that's where the study of geography comes in. And when we're looking into the more troubling diseases that move from biodiverse populations or these zoonotic diseases, is often also a product of land change processes, for example, deforestation, communities living or livestock, which is very close at the frontier of these forests. So involving people who study these processes of land change, identifying who are the people involved, who are the people who are living there, which are the populations that are marginal and compromised. I think that's where you do need to engage with not just the traditional people who study medicine and diseases, but also the other academic disciplines that look into interactions between the human populations and the environment. And that involves people like geographers and people who study sociology.
The biological component of disease is just one part of it. I mean, if you think about people who get infected too, it's because of where they live or the job that they do or the income level that they have or level of education and the like. And so without that understanding, that kind of more sociological and human understanding, you're only really seeing part of the picture. I fully concur with Janice in many of the drivers of these diseases lie in environmental changes that are being caused by humans, deforestation and the like, hunting of wildlife, etc., etc.
A lot of what we've talked about are STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and math. But this climate army that we need needs people beyond STEM fields, correct? What are some fields outside of STEM that are critical in the climate fight?
There are many different subjects to consider. I think history gives us the perspective of how populations have faced environmental change before, how people have coped with it, what are some of the responses that worked or didn't work. I do find that environmental historians have a lot to bring to the table.
Yeah, well, just following on from Janice there, I worked on a project that looked at the risks of infectious diseases in Africa as a result of climate change. And amongst the group, I think it was about 40 researchers who were working on the project were historians. Our understanding of relationships between diseases and the environment goes back a long way. With regard to other non-STEM disciplines, communication is really important, absolutely key to this. So people in your position, for example, getting that message out, making sure it's understandable, and also that it's trusted. I mean, often people are a bit skeptical when certain people are making claims about the climate. So it's finding trusted means of communication as well.
Have there been any surprising fields of work or disciplines that you've had to work with in your career?
I am involved actually in working with architects and looking into landscape planning and understanding how it's important to put the experience of living in the center of their research. So I did find that adopting the way architects perceive the environment is also another way of looking into how you can incorporate sustainability concepts into developing a project and incorporating some of these principles.
What about you, Dr. Taylor? Was there any surprising discipline you've had to work with in your career?
Surprising disciplines. I have worked with designers. I've worked with artists, again, when it comes to communication.
Artists?
Yeah, because people often see messages more clearly than they read or hear them. And so the visual dimension can be quite important in terms of getting a message across. I remember being in Rwanda with a group of students from the university where I used to work, and we'd been staying in this village for about a week. And at the end of the week, the villagers asked us to recount our experiences, but they made a demand. They didn't want another PowerPoint presentation. They were tired of PowerPoint presentations. They wanted the students to do an interpretive dance. And I thought it was brilliant. But the students were from Ireland. They were well up to it.
I mean, you talked about communication, and there's so many ways to communicate the issue of climate change to different audiences as well. So I wouldn't have guessed interpretive dance, but yeah, I suppose that
That's
can
an
make
extreme example.
It's a good assignment to students.
All right, before we let you go, it's quite common for parents to despair when their children say they want to study philosophy or history or worse, literature. What's your elevator pitch for this, given your own experience? Can you make the case for each of these subjects, starting with philosophy?
I think that now with AI and with the STEM disciplines, There's actually quite a lot that is trying to mimic like human behavior and human thought. But we do need the experts in those fields. And actually, philosophy is a study worth going into because it can help us to understand, for example, how to make maybe AI systems more fair. It's also just the pure pursuit of that knowledge discipline that I think gives people that sense of freedom and creativity to think, about how we think and why we think, right? And being involved in a discipline like philosophy challenges you to go deeper in that direction.
Dr. Taylor, what about literature?
Literature. Wow. Well, when I was at school, my literature teacher was really disappointed that I didn't do an A-level in literature. I think actually the way that education is changing now, it doesn't preclude studying more than one discipline. Why not study literature or philosophy alongside chemistry or alongside engineering or whatever? And when it comes down to it, what we're trying to do basically is integrate different kinds of knowledge that's generated by different disciplines. And I think the more exposure you can have to different disciplines, probably the better in the long run.
So we've covered literature, architecture, interpretive dance. I think we're good here, right?
Okay.
Dr. Lee's just doing a little bit of a dance over there. Nobody can see. Unfortunately, we can't share that. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Professor David Taylor from the Department of Geography at the National University of Singapore and Dr. Janice Lee from the Asian School of the Environment at Nanyang Technological University.
Okay, it's time to go to the quiz. European judges have recently ruled that a certain country has breached the human rights of its citizens by not doing enough to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Which country was it? Liling, do you know this one?
Oh, I only know it's Switzerland, but I don't know why and I don't know how. Educate us, Jack.
Of course you knew that one. Yeah, more than 2,000 older Swiss women brought forward this really interesting case. They argued that the government had violated the right to respect for family and private life under the European Convention on Human Rights. So it has really interesting implications, and we are now going to expect to see other types of campaigns and different groups bringing cases against governments now. I did a story about this kind of recently, looking at climate litigation in Southeast Asia, and most of our region generally is still really lagging in bringing forward such litigation, but definitely a space to watch going forward as governments face more pressure to take climate action.
Yeah, I think all signs point to more of this happening with more frequency going forward. Climate litigation, lawsuits, mediation. But it's not just about the cases that will come up here, but about priming and evolving the legal landscape in the region so that they're equipped to deal with lawsuits and disputes here in Southeast Asia. Right, Jack?
Yeah, very complicated cases, and a lot of the case law just doesn't exist yet. But anyway, that's 100% points for you for getting that one right. Okay, let's go to our sustainability word of the week. And this week we're going to unpack climate justice. Now, climate justice, you might hear this especially in reference to activists, young people or others who are out there pushing for equity and human rights to be at the center of the way that decisions are being made and actions are being taken on climate change, and focuses on the ways that some countries have historically been responsible for climate change. Many of those are the world's advanced economies today. So solutions and responsibility should therefore be driven by them, while those vulnerable countries, many of those are our neighbours, or the communities that are exposed to climate change but not responsible for it, should receive justice. So just a little explainer of a term that you might hear in the news. That's all we have for this week. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation. Please do go and follow us on whatever podcast platform you're using. We'd really appreciate it.
And please do send us your questions too, and we'll answer them in the episodes to come. Until then, I am Liling Tan.
And I'm Jack Board. Thanks for joining us, and let's do it again, same time next week.